let everybody in and we'll begin.
Great.
Lovely. Hello, everybody. It's nice to see you all tonight. Thank you all so much for joining us for this evening's event. Tonight we have Ketan Joshi, who will be discussing his new book, Windfall, Unlocking a Fossil-Free Future. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I am currently broadcasting to you from, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Before I hand you over to Ketan this evening, I'd just like to quickly reiterate some information that was sent to you in the email with your link to join tonight's event. So as I mentioned in that email, you've all automatically been placed on mute, but we will still be having a Q&A session later on in the evening. In order to ask questions, you can use the chat box. If you can't see it right now, it should be towards the lower left of your screen. It will pop up in the next couple of minutes, however, when I send you the link to purchase your copy of Windfall. So I'll send that via the chat box. I'd also like to mention that we have a special promotion on at the moment, which is that if you use the code EVENT at checkout when you make a purchase via our website, then you'll receive 10% off your whole order. So as I mentioned, I'll be sending the link via the chat box to purchase your copy of Windfall. And I recommend that you get in within the next 24 hours so that you can make the most of that promotion. And so I would now like to introduce Ketan Joshi. Ketan is a freelance writer specializing in climate and energy, formerly having worked for private and government, including the ARENA clean energy organizations in Australia. He is currently based in Norway. I'll hand over to you now, Ketan. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, and it's really nice to be here, and I'm really looking forward to talking to you about Windfall. I started writing Windfall about 2 years ago, and it has been quite a journey from starting that process to where it is now, and particularly the global climate context that we find ourselves in now. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be reading to you a bit of Windfall that I think has some very significant relevance to some things that we're seeing happening around the world in terms of climate. I'm going to show you a few slides with some charts and some information, but don't worry if you're not into big numbers and things like that, because I will explain to you basically what they mean and how they relate. But I'm going to end with linking it back to a piece of news that came out this morning in Australia. And I think it's some very significant news, and I think that it says a lot about where we're going to go in the next 10 years or so. So let me just get quickly started by telling you a bit about what Windfall is and why I wrote it. Windfall is a book about what has happened in the past in Australia. So what happened to put Australia where it is? And Australia is in this really interesting space in terms of climate where federal policy is not that great. On the global stage, it's doing quite bad in terms of climate action. But from a technological perspective, Australia is actually doing better than a lot of countries. So when it comes to renewables in particular, Australia is doing quite well. My background is renewable energy. So I started out in the wind industry in 2010. I did a lot of analytics, I did a lot of data wrangling and operations and monitoring, but I very quickly moved into communications in the political space because I found that that was where there was actually the greatest lack of understanding about technological and scientific and engineering issues around renewables. And all of this relates very heavily to what I want to talk to you about today, which is blackouts. Now, in the history of taking climate action is something that we need to do. A lot of the opposition to climate action has stemmed from an effort to frame climate action as something that's going to damage us or hurt us. And I'm sure all of you would have seen examples of this. So one example is the May 2019 election last year, where the argument was that if we act on climate too strongly, that will damage the economy. Electricity bills will go up. You won't be able to go on a drive on the weekend because electric vehicle policies will ruin your weekend. All of these things are efforts to paint climate action as a threat, something that hurts us, something that we should be scared of. And when I started writing this book, I realized the idea that climate action is damaging to us is the overarching mythology, the overarching lie over the past 20 years or so that has formed the basis, the through line for the government's, the Conservative government, the Liberal Party, and the National Party has formed their arguments against climate action. You can trace every single line back to this one principle, which is they try to pretend that climate action is something that is bad, that's going to cause pain. So blackouts became the thing back in September 2016. There was a storm, a very significant storm over South Australia. And what happened is that storm knocked out a bunch of power lines and all of South Australia entered into a blackout after that. This is a very rare thing to happen. The last time all of South Australia was blacked out was, I think, 1998. And even then, I think it was the vast majority of South Australia, not all of it, like it was on the night of September 26, 2016. Now, that created a change in energy and climate politics that has stuck. It has lasted. This is something that has become truly baked into the way climate is discussed in a political context in Australia. And I'm going to read to you a bit about that blackout. In chapter 3 of Windfall, I go into some technical detail on the blackout. So basically, what was the cause of the blackout? You know, what role did transmission lines falling down play? What role did wind farms play? What role did decisions made around gas and diesel-fired power stations play? I'm not going to talk about that. What I'm going to talk about is the media and the political response, because I want to tie it into what is happening right now in a couple of places in the world, because I think that you will understand climate action and the rhetoric, hopefully slightly differently, when you think about what is being said about blackouts. So I'm going to read from page 103. This chapter is called Unlocking the Benefits of New Machines. It's the technology-focused chapter. And this section is called The Political Power of Darkness and Fear. This is my first reading, by the way, so I'll try and do like a cool radio voice. I haven't done a radio voice for a while, but I'll try and make it silky. Here we go. During emergencies, Australians overwhelmingly turn to one place for reliable information, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation. Surveys measuring trust in public institutions place the ABC at the top. On the night of the blackout, many millions of Australians would have tuned into the ABC's 24-hour news channel for the latest updates. And on that night, the channel's political editor, Chris Ullman, laid the seeds for how media and politics would react to the event during a 9-minute interview with Senator Nick Xenophon, the South Australian politician who'd led the inquiry into wind turbine syndrome. Quote, 40% of South Australia's power is wind generated, and that has the problem of being intermittent. What we understand at the moment is that those turbines aren't turning because the wind is blowing too fast, unquote, declared Ullman when he opened the segment. He would repeat that 40% value during the interview, despite the mix being closer to 30% for that month. The claim that the turbines were offline because the wind was blowing too fast, completely false, was repeated 3 times. Quote, the South Australian government hasn't taken into account what the consequences are when you put that kind of intermittent energy onto a grid, unquote, Ullman insisted during the interview. It would seem that South Australia has produced this circumstance itself in some ways on the power mixes relying on, Xenophon eagerly concurred. The generation doesn't work when the wind is blowing too hard, he added. This shouldn't have happened. If heads have to roll, so be it, Xenophon said. The interview was a starting point for a broader public narrative, where the goal was to blame something inherent to wind power rather than something resolvable. The argument ran something like this. You can't build a wind turbine that stays online during a thunderstorm. So if the South Australian turbines had shut down due to high winds, the only way to keep the power online would be to never build wind turbines. Ullman and Xenophon were clear in their efforts to blame something incurable rather than something fixable. The narrative began to spread virally across Australia's media outlets. Where are those wind turbines when you need them? Wrote the Australian's political columnist Michael Owen on the night of the blackout. The falsehoods were repeated on the ABC 7:30 program, in which a reporter declared, when questioning Energy Minister Josh Frydenberg, that, quote, South Australia gets 40% of its power from wind power, but that is intermittent. And on days like today, I understand the wind power wasn't operating because of the storm. Days later, Ullman's articles published on the ABC website claimed too much wind power was being generated, and that was what caused the blackout. It could have been a problem if the wind was supplying the bulk of South Australia's power, meaning there was little or no synchronous generation inside South Australia. Before the power outage yesterday, the wind was blowing a gale and the turbines were supplying 70% of the state's power. These early moments were shotgun blasts of contradictory theories that had one commonality, an attempt to blame South Australia's blackout on something inherent to wind power. This was designed to serve as an indictment of climate action and an affirmation of the often repeated warnings that decarbonisation would be ruinous. The story that emerged in the wake of South Australia's System Black was that the blackout was caused by the transition to renewable energy, and it's stuck like dried baby cereal to Australia's political and media landscape, and it has remained there since. I'm just going to add in little notes as I read. I was feeding my kid baby cereal at the time I wrote that sentence, and that's how that metaphor got in there because, my clothes were covered in pockets of oatmeal. Interesting side note, there you go. So many of the blackouts that have occurred since then, either in South Australia or Victoria, undergoing its own slower transition to renewables, have been linked to the presence of wind power. Politicians understand the currency of darkness and loss, and it was mentioned hundreds of times by government players framing the event as the direct consequence of the state government's support for renewable energy. The member for Port Adelaide, Mark Butler, should be ashamed to associate himself with that failed big experiment in South Australia from a tired old Labor government, nearly 16 years old. The Labor Party is the party of higher prices and a less stable power system, declared then Energy Minister Josh Frydenberg in Parliament. Fellow former Energy Minister Melissa Price said, let's look at the gold star winner, South Australia, a Labor government which gave Australia its first statewide blackout. What a legacy. What an absolute bunch of champions. There were 1.7 million people with no lights on, and $500 million of taxpayer money was what the Labor government cost South Australians. And we know that a shortened government would take that failed experiment to a national scale. Things got sillier very quickly. When a plug fell out of a rotating stage at an Adele concert, the Today Show said, Adele found herself rolling in the deep of SA's power debate. Above the strapline, SA power crisis. An army of fake Twitter accounts blaming the blackout on renewables were linked to a Western Australian mining lobby, and the actual mix of reasons behind the event were lost irretrievably in a haze of motivated storytelling. The lie was repeated so many times that it was assumed to be true. South Australia was framed as an electrically famished land, plunged into darkness every second of every day, because turbines were sitting idle without wind, generating too much power, or generating it too variably. The story became a protective, magical chant, designed to ward off the evil spirits of deliberation and logic. And any blackout that happened in a state with wind turbines was assumed to have been caused by renewable energy, just as anybody who experienced headaches or nausea near a wind farm could happily assume that the turbines were to blame. just to explain that line, that's a callback to chapters 1 and 2, in which I explore community engagement issues and health fears around wind turbines. This was the big, dramatic, impactful event that critics hoped would turn the public against renewable energy. The critics wanted Chernobyl, but they wanted it for wind turbines. So I was actually going to stop there, but I just want to continue reading on to the next 2 pages a little bit, because they actually tie in quite nicely with some recent news in Australia. So I'm going to keep going, and I promise I'm all going to weave it together at the end. All right. I'm going to take a water break, because it's been a while since I spoke this consistently for a while. All right. I hope you all enjoyed watching me drink water. In the past several years, major power outages in Australia have been blamed, regardless of the cause, at least in part on renewable energy. A particularly egregious example is when in December 2016, a network fault caused supply interruptions to BHP's Olympic Dam mine, 560 kilometers north of Adelaide. BHP's own media team claimed that the mine had blacked out when their chief executive at the time said, "Olympic Dam's latest outage shows Australia's investability and jobs are placed in peril by the failure of policy to both reduce emissions and secure affordable, dispatchable, uninterrupted power." The Prime Minister at the time, Malcolm Turnbull, said of the event, "You have to take the ideology out of this. Take that left ideology that says somehow or other we can pursue these enormous renewable targets." Sky News commentator Andrew Bolt said, "BHP Billiton had its giant Olympic Dam mine shut down for the second time in 2 months by South Australia's dodgy wind farms." The thing is, there was no outage at the site. The facility has simply had to reduce its consumption from 170 megawatts to 100, as revealed after the event by Renew Economy's Giles Parkinson. Not only was the claim of an outage an outright lie, originating not from conservative media, but from BHP itself, the problems were not caused by wind farms. They were the result of a network failure that could have been rectified more quickly if the gas-fired Dry Creek power station had responded to repeated commands from the grid operator sent between 4 a.m. and 5 a.m. But it did not, because the power traders who were responsible for responding had been told to work from home. You snooze, you lose, and in this case, the company lost $60,000 through a fine. There were plenty of winners, though. A broad range of political and corporate players drew as much capital as they could by blaming wind farms for the consequences of the soothing nap the fossil fuel power station operator had taken in their home. So I'm very tempted to read on because there's a lot of, there are many more really fun and interesting examples of the media and political responses to these grid events that happened in the wake of South Australia's blackout. But I'm gonna resist the temptation, even though I'm reliving all of these fun stories that caused so much frustration and sadness at the time. And I'm gonna show you one chart from slightly later on in this chapter, because it's a good one. It's one of my favorites. And really, it summarizes this issue very neatly. I'm going to awkwardly hold it up to the camera and see if you can see it. It's probably a little too bright. No, there we go. So you probably can't see that particularly well, but all you really need to take from it is, see how stuff is really low here and really high here? That's media coverage of blackouts. Now, these bars are showing the number of articles talking about blackouts and renewables. That's a big spike when the South Australian blackout happened. And what you definitely can't see, because it's a very faint grey line, but buy a copy of the book and you'll be able to look at it very closely, is a line right at the back here. And what it's showing you is that as the media coverage of blackouts increased dramatically after September 2016, the actual number of outages didn't change. And I need to explain something really important here. Blackouts happen for, let's split it out into two simple reasons. The transmission network that transports power is damaged, or the things that generate electricity aren't doing what they're meant to do. Now, often these two things happen in conjunction. It's very, very complicated, but about 98% of the times that you lose power in your home in Australia, it will happen because a tree fell on a line somewhere near to where you live. 1% happen because there is a damage to the large transmission lines, the really big ones that you see out in open areas that stand really, really tall. And the remaining 1% is related to either power stations going offline suddenly, a mismatch between supply and demand, or extreme weather events. That's all contained within that final 1%. So what you can see from what I talked about in that chapter there, and also what I've just described, is that the way we talk about blackouts is very far removed from what is actually happening with blackouts. And in Australia, that moment really set something off, and it has stuck to this day. And it ties in again to this effort to frame climate action as something that we should be afraid of, that we should consider to be too risky and really bad. So let me share my screen. I want to tell you a story about something that happened in California. Now, I've been obsessed with California over the past few weeks because it's really, a lot of things have been happening there that mirror Australia very, very, very closely. And let me just share my screen. Go, share. All right. Emma Kate, is that coming through? Okay, can you see the slides? Yeah, awesome. Okay, so the picture I've got on the back here is a picture it's in California. It looks a little bit like the Golden Gate Bridge, but it's not. It's in another area, and it has become something of an iconic picture because it represents, I guess, the humanity in California, the people, the bridges, the cars, the infrastructure, and then the really tragic and horrible, severe wildfire crisis that is really had such serious impacts. People have lost their lives. The smoke impacts have been very severe. The smoke has traveled, halfway across the world. The heat impacts, of course, has been really serious as well. Smoke has actually covered solar panels in California, impacting the solar generation. Everything I've just listed there, of course, I think at least some of you will remember from Australia's bushfire crisis earlier this year. Very similar thing, and I have a brother who lives in San Francisco, and it's just it was very sad to relive the worry and the anxiety of seeing all my friends and family back home in Australia being impacted by the Black Summer bushfire crisis, and then worrying all the same, for the past few months, because of course, California has been through some really tough times. One of the things that happened during the past month, as a result of extreme climate impacts, and in this particular case, heat waves, has been an impact on the grid. When extreme weather events start to impact the grid, like the extreme and unprecedented storm in South Australia in September 2016, and the extreme heat waves that are happening in California over the past few months, we actually start to see impacts on the things that generate electricity and the things that transport electricity. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what happened in California. California actually had to do what are called rolling blackouts or load shedding. Now, this is not a tree falling on a power line. This is a mismatch between how much power is being generated and how much is being consumed. These two things have to be precisely the same at a millisecond level for a grid to run properly. If they are not precisely the same, I won't go into it, but bad things start to happen. Appliances start to explode, things start to automatically disconnect. This is what happened in South Australia too. But of course, that itself was triggered by power lines being destroyed. Now, in California, these rolling blackouts were triggered because there was not enough supply of power. Demand spiked due to a heat wave. There is very, very high usage of air conditioning in California, and heat waves therefore have a very serious impact on the grid. What was different about this is that California normally imports a lot of power from neighboring states, but this heat wave wasn't just sitting over California. This heat wave was spread across a bunch of different states as well, which means those states were also using a lot of power, which means they couldn't actually transport power from those other states into California. Everywhere was under stress because this heat wave was weird and different. And of course, it's not weird because we understand exactly why this is happening. It's the consequence of the burning of fossil fuels, trapping more heat in the atmosphere and resulting in higher temperatures in the height of summer, as we've been, I guess, warning about for quite some time. Now, these blackouts lasted about, off the top of my head, I think it was about half an hour to 1 hour. But many customers were impacted. And what the grid operator does is they're called rolling blackouts because it cuts off one chunk of people, restores them, cuts off another chunk of people, restores them, cuts off another chunk of people, and then restores them. That's the rolling part of rolling blackouts, because it actually minimizes the time that any one group of people is exposed to having no power to their home. And as you would expect, as you can see in this slide, and I hope you can read it, but I will just make it a little bit bigger for you. As you can see, and I'll read out some of these tweets for you. California being load shed as we tweet. A massive over-reliance on renewables in the state seems to be a part of the problem. Extreme temps in the state and grid challenges due to RE variability means RE gets turned off. So what happened here is California is undergoing a very significant transition to renewables in very much the same way that South Australia was back in 2016. And as you can see, the political element of the response to California's rolling blackouts matched Australia's 2016 responses very closely. In this particular case, we can go right to the top and look at Donald Trump's tweets, who said that Democrats are unable to keep up with energy demand. In California, Democrats have intentionally implemented rolling blackouts. The Bernie Biden AOC Green New Deal plan would take California's failed policies to every American. The Green New Deal, of course, is the Democrats' overarching climate plan, looking to transition Australia to green energy, but also the focus heavily on jobs and equity. So I've included a couple of examples of the Liberal Party response to South Australia's blackouts. These are particularly egregious. Blackout bill at it again. The simple formula of bill shorten equals higher power bills and more blackouts. This is not, complicated or nuanced stuff. And they've got a little this is a South Australia with the lights on everywhere except South Australia, and they've got an arrow pointing to South Australia, and the label here says wind turbine state. So blackouts create this political opportunity to really make people fearful of climate action. And we're seeing this happen with California really significantly. This is just another one. The Global Warming Policy Foundation is a sort of long-time climate denial think tank that came from the UK, but they did this in response to the California blackouts last month, and I just found it funny in that it just matches the imagery and the sort of cruel language that are used by Australia, that was used by Australia's political groups. You can see here, they're not sensitive or smart or even really thinking about the impacts of the kind of words they're using. So it's really horrific stuff that they do. So I want to talk to you about the bigger picture of what's going on in the US here. Now, California's blackouts happened because it happened for a bunch of reasons. So, as you would expect, I feel like it's almost silly to say this at this point because I'm sure you know what I'm about to say. But two gas-fired power stations shut down unexpectedly due to the heat wave in California, and that played a significant role in why those blackouts occurred. Solar power, and I'll get into this a little bit later on, solar power is a very large proportion of California's power system. As the Earth rotates, the sun stops shining on California. The Earth has been rotating for a long time. I guess it's really something that we can predict, is that the Earth will continue to move in a circle, and that the sun will stop shining on California as the sun sets. So the grid operator was fully aware that the sun would set. And what happened is that the pre-existing assets were not able to ramp up and meet demand as the grid operator had planned. I guess one interesting thing to note as well, to be as charitable as possible, the forecasting of wind energy did actually play a bit of a role in the first of the two blackouts. So what happened is the grid operator thought that there would be X number of megawatts of wind power generating, and it actually turned out to be less. And this happens sometimes because you can forecast wind to some degree, but you can't forecast it perfectly because the atmosphere is a really complicated system, and it's, as anyone has checked the weather forecast would know. So they're very, very good at forecasting wind most of the time, but sometimes it can be slightly less than expected, and that actually happened with that first blackout. Resulting in, I think it was 100 megawatts off the top of my head of less power from wind than they anticipated. That wasn't the case in the second one. Again, gas-fired power shutting down played the key role there. What it was framed as is, why wasn't solar generating at night, right? So these blackouts happened in the evening, during the evening peak, when things were really hot. And, solar power doesn't generate at night. We already know this. So what it becomes then is a question of, why didn't the grid operator plan to have the resources available to meet demand when it knew exactly what was going to happen with renewable energy, of course, with the caveat of wind in that first instance. And this ties into a much bigger question of, how do you plan for the future in the context of all of this dramatic and emotive and extremely incorrect talk about blackouts. And what I've got on this slide here is a really, really great article. And I recommend, later on, Google the headline of this article and have a read of it, because it is a fascinating study on how the Trump administration took a national government-funded lab's efforts to plan for the future of the grid, specifically planning for the growth of wind and solar, and said to them, you have to stop this. You can't release this study because what the study found is that coal-fired power starts to decline very, very rapidly in almost every scenario, and the Trump administration doesn't like government bodies releasing information about the fact that coal-fired power is on its way out in the US. The consequence is that this study, which is looking at trying to integrate wind and solar as effectively as possible, was nixed. And that is, first of all, it's a shocking and I guess almost frightening example of a government censoring a research agency, which is essentially, no, it's not essentially, it is literally trying to prevent blackouts in the future and control grid reliability as it transitions to a zero carbon grid. But I guess more significantly, is something that has a near-term impact. If you can't plan for the growth of renewable energy, then what you're going to see is coal and gas-fired power stations shutting down without anything there to replace them. I have had a long-running conspiracy theory that basically what is happening here is that grids are being intentionally mismanaged. And the consequence of intentional grid mismanagement is that more blackouts happen. More people lose power, the blackouts are worse. They impact more people. And the consequence of that is that you get this ongoing feedstock of political resources, right? So the more blackouts that happen, the more times you can say, don't build renewables because blackouts are happening. And of course, that in turn causes more grid mismanagement because no one can plan for the future, which in turn causes more blackouts. And this is an absolutely horrible cycle to get stuck into. Just to jump back to California. These are the two blackouts here. So this is the first one. This is the second one. You can actually see gas is the dark brown color here, and you can see the little spiky sections on the top. Solar went up during the day and it went down in the evening, as it always does. Wind was slightly lower than expected. Here, wind was actually helping to make the blackouts less bad. They could have been far worse. And you can see here imports were also taken in from other states as well. I just wanted to show you the relatively decent chunk of solar that California gets from its resources. So, all right. So again, don't worry about reading these charts too closely. I'll just tell you roughly what they mean. So the chart on the left-hand side here. Wait, is that your left-hand side or right side? I don't know. The chart with the brown bits on it is all of California's power generation. The brown is gas. The blue is nuclear and geothermal. The green is, I think it's biomass and hydropower. And the most important part of this chart here is the yellow bit. It goes back to 2007 up to May 2020. And you can see basically over the past few years, solar has actually grown quite a lot in California, to the point where it's actually coming up to, I think it's about 35 to 36% of total generation. Now, that's pretty good, you know, that's a lot of solar. And the other chart here just splits it out by zero carbon sources only. So you can see, even if you exclude fossil fuels from what you're talking about, solar is a pretty decent chunk in California. Now, South Australia hit that point of about 30%. And, you know, I mentioned it when I was reading that little section. It's that 30% point when what we start to see is that the people who manage the grid suddenly need to start thinking about planning. They need to start thinking about integration and the way that we make these new machines part of a grid that was designed for old machines. And I guess what we're really starting to see is that point, that 30 to 35% point, becomes a point at which probably something is going to happen. And it's going to involve renewables in some way, shape, or form. And that becomes a political opportunity. And it's a real problem. It's a real risk to becoming baked into the way we talk about climate action. All right, let's move on. So, wait, come back. There we go. So what I want to do, though, is really highlight something interesting. California is not bursting ahead of the pack with solar as much as it is being framed as in all of these political arguments, right? So the chart with the sort of orange line here is comparing California, that's the purple line, to South Australia, that's the green line, and to the national electricity market, which is the East Coast grid in Australia. That's the orange line. Now, it's looking at the percentage of solar, so not wind and solar, only solar, on a monthly basis. And you know what? There are actually times when South Australia has more solar than California. So the idea that they're sort of bursting ahead of the pack and that's why they're having all these problems highlights something really, really important to me, which is basically, it's not about the amount of renewables that you have. It's how you manage the grid. And so California's grid is suffering from mismanagement problems, not from renewable problems. If the problem was renewables, South Australia would be having rolling blackouts as we speak. There is a really high percentage of solar in South Australia. Now, South Australia, you know, it has even less interconnection And the national electricity market has no interconnection. It's an isolated grid that covers Queensland, South Australia, New South Wales, Victoria, and Tasmania. And they actually manage the integration of solar pretty well. So really, Australia's grid operator is doing a pretty decent job. And the other side is just 2 days less selected, comparing California to the national electricity market. Solar is pretty much closely matched in terms of the proportion of total over those 2 days. Now, I won't spend too much time on this because I think we're sort of getting close to time a little bit, but this just shows the percentage of variable renewables in a bunch of different countries. If you're interested in grid stuff, I highly recommend digging into that a little bit later on. This is an important one. So what we're actually seeing with California over the long term is that long-term reliability is not being impacted by the amount of solar that is being built on the grid. This purple chunk here is the proportion of solar on the grid, right? This green line here is reliability. Now, the higher this number is, the higher this green line is, the better reliability is. So you can actually see that since about 2016, as solar has increased, the quality of grid reliability has actually increased slightly too. The one on the right-hand side, all you basically need to know is that the lower the lines are, the better. And as you can see, as solar has increased, the lines have started to decrease, which means that grid reliability is starting to get better in California too. Part of the reason for this is because California is investing very heavily in battery storage. There's a whole bunch of big batteries being built there. This is a pattern that we start to see as we expand outwards into different countries. Germany has a huge quantity of renewables, wind and solar. The number of minutes, this is the line, the number of minutes of outages that people are experiencing is decreasing. Ditto for Australia. As the proportion of renewables increases, the reliability of the grid is unchanged. And it's because that's being managed well. In the future, what we are going to see in a best case scenario is a whole bunch of wind and solar coming online and a whole bunch of coal and gas retiring. This green slice here is a forward-looking forecast by Australia's grid operator, and it's a whole bunch of wind and solar. It is an incredible amount, and it dominates the generation in the future. The chart on the right-hand side here is coal and gas shutting down. Those plants are forecast to shut down in the middle scenario. So this is even if we don't look at an optimistic emission scenario, all these plants are going to shut down. All of these things are going to require a lot of planning. So I'm going to link it to something that happened today. The Prime Minister and Australia's Energy Minister did a release about why there needs to be more gas. And if you look at the press releases, I did a little word search here for the number of times the word reliable was used. This traces all the way back to what I talked about when I read the section of this book from 2016 and 2017. The rhetoric around the grid has been about reliability. Now, what we actually know is that you can integrate wind and solar, very, very high penetrations of wind and solar without fossil fuels. You don't need gas. But because the framing of climate action has been, if you do this, if you take this action, then things won't be reliable. There will be blackouts, there will be darkness. We see it in California, we see it in Australia. Then this theme starts to come up more and more. And in today's press release, it is very, very specifically being used as a justification to build new fossil fuels. I wrote a piece for this today in Renew Economy. Pop over to my Twitter feed if you wanna have a read of it. I stayed up pretty late last night, getting quite mad about it because it's just totally wrong. You actually can safely shut down coal and gas-fired power stations, and you can replace them with renewables. And not only is that the more reliable option, it is the cheaper option too. This is a study from 2017. Liddell is the next coal-fired power station that Australia is going to shut down in the year 2023. And what you replace it with is an interesting question. The first option in this chart called extend is if you keep that coal-fired power station option. Angus Taylor tried very, very hard to do that, even threatening at one point to purchase that coal-fired power station from AGL just to keep it open, was A, the most expensive option, and B, the highest emissions option, of course. The other option AGL proposed was to replace it with a mix of batteries, gas, and renewables, also pretty expensive, but lower emissions. The zero emissions option was also the cheapest option. And of course, it has the highest impact on grid reliability because the people who modeled this looked at using not only batteries, but actually demand response. So that's when people actually get paid money to turn their power down when they're not really using it. So that increases energy efficiency and reduces power bills. And that is why that it has such a significant downward pressure on the amount that people pay for electricity. So I'm not gonna talk about these other things because we don't have time, and I'd love to get to some questions. If there are no questions, I will actually hop into some of these. This is all in the book as well, of course. I dig into this in a lot of detail and with plenty of funny, weird, and I guess teeth gnashing, someone described it as, stories. So Emma, Kate, I might just pass it back to you to see if there are any questions, and if not, I'm happy to dive back into some of these things for another 10 minutes or so.
Yeah, we've had one question come through, and it's from Jen. And Jen asks, what do you think about AEMO's proposal to be able to switch off rooftop solar at will?
Yeah. This is actually this is something that I followed closely because it came out. So a couple of months ago, so AEMO is Australia's grid operator, the Australian Energy Market Operator. And they're having this really interesting and dramatic, I guess, like struggle with how to deal with distributed energy resources. So those are when people have a solar on their rooftop, or they have a battery, or they have some combination of that. And what happens is that those machines are not treated like normal generators. So sometimes they sit behind the device that collects information about how much electricity is being consumed in your home. It's called behind the meter. Now, these are becoming an incredible and new and very novel type of power station. Millions of Australians have a flat panel on the top of their homes, and it generates electricity at a level that exceeds that of the big hulking thermal generators that we've seen in the past, of course, during the day when the sun is shining. Now, the first issue that the grid operator has to deal with, as I sort of hinted at a little bit earlier on in some of those charts, is they need to know what the generation is going to be. And they need to kind of have an idea of what's going to happen in the next 5 minutes, or in some cases, of course, the next few seconds. They also need to be able to control generators. So at the moment, if there's a coal-fired power station, they can say to that coal-fired power station, ramp up or ramp down, this is an order because there's too much power or there's too little power. Of course, with solar, you can't really request them to turn up, although of course there are some interesting suggestions around, I guess like over generation. But my personal feeling about it is that I think that it would probably be a good thing. And the reason behind that is it will enable the growth of distributed energy resources a bit better. But I also understand that there is a bit of nervousness about how it actually plays out. And I really get those concerns because in an ideal situation, people really have access to understanding why this is happening, and I guess, potentially having compensation, because, being able to turn up and turn down generators, sometimes you have to do it in an emergency. Other times it's there to help the grid. And so people who generate electricity should get paid for doing so because they're helping, they're providing a service. And currently, for instance, big batteries provide a service in that they can, generate really like super, super fast, like in the millisecond time scale, they can generate up and down super quickly. This is where the level of control that a grid operator has on people's homes, the stuff that's in your house so that you're generating or consuming electricity, this is going to be one of the biggest debates over the next decade, because first of all, people really don't like it when you control their stuff without your permission. They really hate it. And I guess I can sort of understand that sentiment to some degree. But on the other hand, people absolutely love participating in this. They love being a player and having access to the ability to make money, just from their rooftop generating electricity or a battery that they invested in, providing power when it's needed, or even in the future, of course, an electric vehicle plugged into a home could serve the same functionality as a battery. So it has to be a two-way street. There has to be something in it for people. There really has to be something that encourages participation. And I guess the other overarching point that I want to make there, and I dig into it in a bit of detail in the book, is that if people are really involved at this level, if they're becoming players in the growth of renewables, then it has a really, really positive impact on climate action. Like, this is something that really changes the tone, right? Back in 2015, the renewable energy target, which looks at really big renewable power stations, was under threat. Tony Abbott was trying to axe it. He hates it. Angus Taylor really doesn't like it either. And part of the push against it actually came from the owners of rooftop solar. Even though they weren't necessarily going to be the direct beneficiaries of this policy, they understood the benefits of renewables, and they understood how much advantage you can get from having direct participation in it. And then the final note I think to add there is that not everyone owns a home. Not everyone has a rooftop. I live in an apartment here in Oslo, and it's a rental property. So it's not easy for everybody to participate like this. And so you really have to, just on the point of increasing participation in climate action, you actually need to have ways of having climate action where people with low incomes can participate, so they can see the benefits of lower electricity bills. People who are locked out of the housing market, or people who can't afford an electric car or can't afford to change their car, or who would prefer not to use a car at all and use active transport like cycling and walking and public transport. All these things are going to have a really big impact on how we make decisions around the future of the grid. So I think I also kind of have a bit of I think the grid operator has a good feeling for this sort of stuff. They are being led by a woman whose name is Audrey Zibelman, and she's just fantastic. She's one of the greatest energy experts in the world. She really led a big transition in New York. I recommend looking her up and looking up some of her previous work, because she has just such clear sight about what needs to happen next, and how, I hate using the word consumers, but just people, the way people will play a role in this transition. So yeah, don't step on toes where you don't need to, but give people benefits as much as you possibly can, particularly those who wouldn't traditionally have access to those benefits. So that's a bit of a long answer, Jan, but I hope it answers the question. Emma, do we have any more?
We do. We've had a few more questions come in, and actually, because of the time, we may not get to all of them, in which case, is it all right, Ketan, if I share your Twitter handle so that people can contact you there after the event if they want to ask more questions?
Of course, yeah,
and we
absolutely.
can finish on one which has come through in worded in a couple of different ways, but roughly the same theme. And it's from Inda, and Inda says, it sounds like the transition is fraught with politics and therefore hurdles. And what can we at grassroots level do to drive the changes to renewable energy at a national level? What's your dream stepwise population-led program to make this happen?
Wow, that's such a great question. I hate to do this, but the answer is in the first two chapters of this book, but I'll give you a short answer. I guess something you'll probably tell when you read the book is that I'm a bit of a, I have become a little bit jaded when it comes to political change. And I think the biggest problem when it comes to politics is the influence of the corporations who profit from the extraction and burning of fossil fuels in political decision making. Of course, things like real-time disclosures of donations and things like that will have a big impact on helping to reverse that. But when it comes down to it, the biggest change is going to come from people and people coming together to become greater than the sum of their parts. I split it out into two sections essentially in the book. The first section is becoming a direct, I sort of covered this in the previous answer, but becoming a direct participant in changes in energy. So of course, you don't have to have rooftop on your roof. Sorry, you don't have to have solar on your rooftop to do this. You can donate to community energy organizations. You can donate to organizations that look to help reduce electricity bills by building community solar in low-income areas and in social housing and things like that. I really, really, really recommend doing that sort of thing. And when you do it, talk to people about it. Tell people what you did. And that has such an incredible impact when you say, I spent my day, taking climate action, and, people really don't understand how good it feels to do that sort of thing. And they need to hear it from a friend. They need to hear it from family. The other thing you can do is take your money away from fossil fuels. So you divest essentially the money that you have in your bank, or that's in your super, or that's in your industry, that's in your super fund. There are a lot of tools out there. I recommend going to the Market Forces website. And again, when you do that, tell someone how you felt when you did it. When I moved my money away from fossil fuels, when I moved my super money away from fossil fuels, it felt so damn good, and I'm constantly feeling bad. I'm constantly, when I'm researching all the stuff that's gone wrong, I feel kind of crappy, and it doesn't feel nice to read about it and write about it. And then I do that and I'm like, wow, it actually, I have done something significant and it feels good to do it. So I really strongly recommend doing that. The final point is a bit fraught in 2020, and it basically involves activism and marches and protest. Of course, there is a pandemic, and of course, sorry, I couldn't really get into that. I'd love to get into that in the future, but of course, if you look up my Twitter feed and my writing, I've written about COVID-19 in many places. But when it comes time to protesting and getting back on the streets, that stuff has an impact that is just beyond words. The impact of protest and civil action. Of course, Extinction Rebellion have been doing a lot of fantastic work. The youth climate movements have been doing amazing work. You need to support them as hard as you possibly can. And of course, when protests are organized, get out on the street and stand there and march with them, because physical presence had an impact on climate action in 2019 that, of course, I don't have a lot of space to get into in the book because it was when I was finishing it up. But the impact was incredible, and the shifts in politics and corporate culture were noticeable. And that was just the start. So that stuff, when you do it, it manifests. The numbers change, the investments in renewables go up, and the closures of coal mines start to go up too, and the closures of coal-fired power stations. These things have a real impact on the world. We're starting to see that more and more. So I guess we can probably wrap it up there. But when you do that stuff, it matters. It changes the shape of the world. It changes the number of molecules of greenhouse gases being emitted into the atmosphere. So you need to feel good about it when you do it, and you need to be proud. That's my 2 cents.
Thank you so much. And I think on that note, because we've reached time, unfortunately, as I said, I'm sorry if I didn't make it to your questions. I've posted Ketan's Twitter link in the chat box, so you can contact him there and follow his Twitter feed for some answers to those questions if we didn't get to them tonight. Ketan, thank you so much. This has been an absolutely wonderful discussion of your book. I'm now going to take everybody off mute so that they can join me in thanking you tonight. And we hope that you all enjoyed the evening. And thank you so much for having an event with us. Everybody should be off mute now.
Thanks, Ketan.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Good night.
Bye.